So Margaret, how's the lake house? My brother Daniel asked that question with the same casual smile he always wore at family dinners, the kind that made people think he was relaxed and confident. But the moment the words left his mouth, something inside me went still. What lake house? I said. The room fell quiet. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and for a brief second his expression flickered, just enough for me to notice. Then he laughed, a quick, dismissive sound. Very funny, he said. Dad's lake house. The one they left you. I stared at him across the table, trying to understand whether this was some strange joke I wasn't in on. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey and rosemary stuffing, the same Thanksgiving meal we had shared every year for as long as I could remember. My parents' old oak table was polished to a shine, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the kitchen window, turning the dust in the air into tiny floating sparks. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. Except suddenly, nothing felt the same at all. Daniel, I said slowly, I have no idea what you're talking about. My brother leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if he had just asked the most ordinary question in the world. You're telling me you didn't get the lake house, he asked. The one on Cedar Ridge. Dad always said it was yours. Cedar Ridge. The name hit me like a memory I hadn't opened in years. I could see it instantly, the narrow gravel road winding through tall pine trees, the small wooden dock stretching into the quiet water, the red canoe my father used to keep tied to the railing with a thick white rope. That place had been our family's favorite escape when we were kids. Every summer my father would pack the old station wagon before sunrise, and Daniel and I would ride in the back seat with our fishing rods sticking out the window. But the lake house had never belonged to us. At least, not that I knew of. Dad never owned that place, I said quietly. He rented it. Daniel tilted his head, studying me in a way that made my stomach tighten. No, he replied. He bought it years ago. Across the table, our family lawyer, Robert Klein, had been silent. The entire time. He was in his late 60s, with neatly combed gray hair and the careful posture of someone who had spent a lifetime sitting behind polished desks. He had handled my parents' legal affairs for decades, and after my father passed away 3 months ago, he had continued helping us sort through paperwork and accounts. But now he was watching me with a look I couldn't quite read. Not confusion. Not surprise. Something else. Something closer to concern. Margaret, he said finally, his voice calm but measured, you never received the deed? The word hung in the air. Deed. I felt my chest tighten slightly. No, I said. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle. Maybe Mom changed her mind before she passed, he said. You know how she was. But Robert Klein didn't laugh. In fact, his eyes shifted from Daniel back to me, and the expression on his face grew more serious. For the first time that evening, the room felt smaller. The warm glow of the kitchen lights suddenly seemed too bright, too sharp. And somewhere deep in the quiet space between Daniel's casual smile and our lawyer's steady gaze, I began to feel the first faint crack in the story I thought I understood about my own family. The silence that followed our lawyer's question stretched across the table like something heavy that no one wanted to touch. Daniel shifted in his chair and reached for his glass of iced tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the sides as he took a long sip. He still looked relaxed, almost amused, as if this entire conversation were nothing more than a harmless misunderstanding that would sort itself out before dessert. But Robert Klein did not look amused at all. He folded his hands carefully on the table and looked directly at me again. Margaret, he said slowly, your father made very clear arrangements regarding that property. The way he said the word arrangements made my stomach tighten. My father had always been a careful man. George Hayes believed in keeping records for everything. He kept receipts in labeled envelopes, balanced his checkbook every Sunday afternoon, and filed every document in neat manila folders in the study cabinet. Growing up, Daniel and I used to joke that if Dad ever misplaced a single paper, it would probably cause a small earthquake. So hearing our lawyer say that there were arrangements I knew nothing about felt deeply unsettling. Robert, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, I never received any paperwork about a lake house. Not a deed, not a letter, nothing. Daniel let out a quiet sigh and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Maybe you forgot, he said. You have been under a lot of stress since Dad passed. His tone sounded sympathetic, but something about the way he avoided looking directly at me made the words feel rehearsed. I studied his face for a moment. Daniel had always been the confident one in our family. 2 years older than me, taller, louder, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately take control of the conversation. Our parents had often said he had a natural gift for leadership. He had built a successful construction company by the time he was 35, bought a large house outside Columbus, and drove a black pickup truck that seemed permanently dusted with sawdust and drywall powder. Compared to him, I had always lived a quieter life. I worked as a librarian for nearly 40 years at the county public library. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment about 15 miles from my parents' old home. My life was steady and predictable, filled with books, morning coffee, and long evening walks around the same neighborhood park. The idea that my father might have quietly left me a lake house felt so unexpected that it almost seemed impossible. Across from me, Robert Klein cleared his throat gently. The deed was prepared and notarized nearly 4 years ago, he said. Your father insisted that the property be transferred to you. Daniel's chair creaked softly as he leaned back again. Well, he said with a shrug, if that is the case, then maybe something got lost in the mail. Robert did not respond right away. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. The soft sound of the paper sliding across the table seemed louder than it should have been. He opened the folder carefully and glanced down at the first page before lifting his eyes back toward me. Margaret, he said, that is exactly what I am trying to understand. At that moment I noticed something I had not seen before. The document he was holding had my name printed clearly across the top in bold black letters. Margaret Hayes. My father's handwriting appeared beneath it in blue ink. And suddenly the quiet Thanksgiving dinner that had felt so familiar only minutes earlier began to feel like the beginning of a story I had never been told. For a few seconds I could not move. My name stared back at me from the top of the document like something that did not belong there. I felt the warmth of the dining room slowly fade as my mind tried to understand what I was seeing. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. I had watched that same careful blue ink fill out birthday cards and grocery lists for more than 60 years. George Hayes wrote slowly, deliberately, every letter shaped the same way. Seeing it there on an official document made my chest feel tight. Robert, I said quietly, are you certain that document was meant for me? Robert Klein nodded once, calmly. Your father was very specific, he replied. The Cedar Ridge property was to be transferred to you. He instructed me to prepare the paperwork personally. Across the table Daniel shifted again, this time with a small impatient sigh. This is getting a little dramatic, he said. Dad talked about that place all the time, but it was never anything official. His tone sounded casual, but I noticed that he had stopped eating completely. The plate of turkey in front of him sat untouched, and his fingers tapped lightly against the table as if he were waiting for the conversation to end. Robert did not seem bothered by Daniel's comment. He turned the folder slightly so that I could see the page more clearly. The document contained several paragraphs of legal language that I could not fully absorb at that moment, but certain words stood out clearly. Property transfer. Ownership. Cedar Ridge County. And then my name again. Margaret Hayes. I looked up slowly. If this was signed 4 years ago, I asked, why am I only hearing about it now? Robert hesitated before answering. It was not a long pause, but it was enough to make me notice. Your father asked that the transfer remain private until the will was formally reviewed, he said. He believed it would avoid unnecessary conflict within the family. Daniel gave a short laugh that did not sound friendly. Conflict, he repeated. Dad was always worried about things that never happened. But something about his voice felt strange now. For the first time since the conversation began, he looked directly at Robert instead of at me. You said the paperwork was prepared, Daniel continued. That does not mean the property was actually transferred. Robert closed the folder halfway, resting his hand on top of it. His expression remained calm, but his voice became firmer. The deed was signed and notarized, he said. That means the transfer was legally recognized. The words seemed to settle heavily over the table. Outside the window the late November sky had begun to darken, and the reflection of the kitchen lights shimmered faintly against the glass. I felt an unfamiliar unease growing quietly inside me. My father had always believed in fairness. If he had made a decision about that lake house, there had to be a reason. But the longer I looked at Daniel's face, the more I sensed that he already understood something I did not. And in that moment I realized that the story my brother had been telling about our parents' estate might not be the complete truth after all. Daniel did not say anything for several seconds after Robert finished speaking. The quiet in the dining room became so heavy that even the soft ticking of the old wall clock near the kitchen doorway sounded unusually loud. I had heard that clock my entire life. My father bought it from a small antique shop in Dayton when I was in high school, and every Sunday afternoon he carefully wound it with a small brass key. The steady ticking used to make the house feel calm and predictable. Now it only made the silence feel sharper. Daniel finally cleared his throat and leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table. Dad talked about Cedar Ridge sometimes, he said slowly. But that place was just a vacation spot. He would not have signed it over without mentioning it to me. His voice carried a confidence that might have sounded convincing to anyone who did not know him well. But I had known Daniel for 66 years. I recognized the small signs he could not hide when he felt uncomfortable. His fingers were tapping against the table again, a quick restless rhythm that he used to do as a teenager whenever he was caught in a situation he did not expect. Robert Klein remained calm. He slid the folder a few inches closer to me across the polished surface of the oak table. The movement was slow and deliberate, as if he wanted me to take my time seeing it clearly. Your father believed that the lake house meant something special to you, he said. He told me that many times. I looked down at the paper again, and suddenly the memories of Cedar Ridge returned more vividly than before. The cabin itself had been simple. It was a small wooden structure with faded green shutters and a porch that faced the water. In the early mornings the lake was so still that the pine trees reflected perfectly across the surface. My father used to wake before sunrise, brew coffee on the old stove, and sit outside listening to the loons calling across the water. Daniel and I would usually still be asleep in the bunk beds inside, wrapped in blankets while the smell of bacon drifted through the cabin. I had always thought of those summers as temporary moments, something we borrowed from the owners who rented it to us each year. The idea that my father had quietly purchased that place felt almost unreal. When did he buy it? I asked softly. Robert adjusted his glasses before answering. Approximately 6 years ago, he said. He considered it an investment at first. But over time he began referring to it as Margaret's Place. The phrase lingered in the air. Margaret's Place. Daniel shifted again, his chair legs scraping lightly against the hardwood floor. That does not make sense, he said. Dad never mentioned anything about giving that property away. His voice sounded firmer now, but the confidence from earlier had faded slightly. I slowly lifted my eyes from the document and looked directly at him. For the first time since the conversation began, I noticed something else in his expression. It was not anger. It was not confusion either. It looked closer to calculation, as if he were trying to decide how much he should say next. And in that quiet moment, sitting at the same table where our family had shared hundreds of ordinary dinners over the years, I began to understand that the story surrounding Cedar Ridge might have been unfolding for much longer than I had ever realized. Daniel's chair scraped lightly against the floor as he pushed it back an inch, the sound sharp in the quiet dining room. He folded his arms across his chest and looked toward the window instead of at me. Outside, the last bit of daylight had faded into a deep gray evening, and the porch light had turned on automatically, casting a pale glow across the backyard. For years that light had switched on every evening at exactly 6:30, something my father had set with careful precision. George Hayes believed that small routines kept a house in order. Watching that light now, I suddenly wondered how many other things in our family had been quietly arranged without my knowledge. Robert Klein remained seated calmly beside the table, the folders still resting in front of him. He turned another page slowly and glanced down at the document before speaking again. "Your father visited the lake house often during the past few years," he said. "Sometimes alone, sometimes with your mother. He told me he liked the quiet there. Said it reminded him of earlier times." Daniel gave a short breath through his nose, something close to a quiet laugh but without any humor. "Dad liked a lot of places," he said. "That does not mean he was planning to hand them out." Robert did not react to the comment. Instead he looked directly at me again. "Margaret, do you remember the last summer your father asked you to drive up to Cedar Ridge with him?" The question caught me off guard. I searched my memory for a moment, and then the image slowly returned. It had been almost 2 years ago, late August, one of those warm Midwestern afternoons when the air smells faintly of pine and sun-warmed grass. My father had called me on a Saturday morning and asked if I could take a short drive with him. He said he wanted to check on something at the lake before the fall season started. I remembered thinking it was a little unusual, because Daniel normally handled things related to property or repairs. But I had agreed without asking many questions. We had driven nearly 90 miles north along Highway 23, passing long stretches of farmland and small towns with quiet main streets. My father spent most of the drive talking about ordinary things. He mentioned the weather, asked about the library, and pointed out a roadside diner he said served the best blueberry pie in the county. When we arrived at Cedar Ridge, he had walked slowly along the wooden dock while I stood near the water watching the sunlight ripple across the lake. At one point he placed his hand on the porch railing and said something that had seemed casual at the time. "You always liked this place more than Daniel did," he said. I remembered smiling and telling him that Daniel preferred the city. Then my father had nodded thoughtfully and looked out across the water for a long moment before saying, "Some places feel like home the moment you arrive." At the time I thought he was simply being sentimental. Now, sitting at the dining room table with the legal document bearing my name lying only a few inches away, that memory began to feel very different. And judging by the tightening line in Daniel's expression, I had the growing sense that my father's quiet trip to Cedar Ridge might have meant far more than I had ever realized. The memory of that quiet afternoon at Cedar Ridge lingered in my mind long after the dining room returned to silence. I could still see my father standing at the edge of the dock, his hands resting lightly on the wooden railing as he looked across the water. At the time I thought he had simply wanted company on a peaceful drive. Now I began to realize that he might have been showing me something he had already decided belonged to me. Daniel shifted again in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck, something he only did when he felt uneasy. The confident ease he had carried earlier in the evening was slowly fading. "Look," he said finally, glancing from me to Robert, "even if Dad filled out some paperwork years ago, that does not mean the situation is still the same. Things change." Robert Klein lifted his eyes from the folder and studied my brother for a moment. "Legal ownership does not change unless it is formally amended," he said calmly. "And there is no record of that happening." Daniel let out a slow breath and leaned forward again. "You are making this sound more complicated than it is," he replied. "Dad talked to me about managing the property after he got older. I have been the one taking care of it. That statement caught my attention immediately. Taking care of it? I repeated quietly. Daniel shrugged as if the answer were obvious. Maintenance, taxes, small repairs. The place needed work. His tone suggested that his involvement had been natural and expected, but something about the way he said it made a new question rise in my mind. If he had been maintaining the property, then he must have been visiting it regularly. That meant he had known for years that my father owned the place. Robert turned another page in the folder and spoke in the same steady voice he had used all evening. The tax statements for Cedar Ridge have been mailed to the Hayes family address every year, he said. Your father handled the payments until last winter. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Exactly, he said quickly. Dad paid for it. That proves he kept control. Robert did not raise his voice, but there was a quiet firmness in his next words. The property was placed in Margaret's name. Your father continued covering the taxes because he insisted on doing so. I felt a slow wave of understanding begin to form in my thoughts. My father had always been protective in quiet ways. When Daniel started his construction business, Dad helped him buy his first set of equipment but never spoke about it publicly. When my mother needed medical treatment several years ago, he handled every bill himself without letting either of us worry about it. It would have been completely like him to purchase the lake house, transfer it quietly, and continue managing the details without announcing it to the rest of the family. Across the table, Daniel looked toward the window again, his jaw tightening slightly as he stared out into the darkness beyond the porch light. The steady ticking of the old wall clock filled the room once more. And in that quiet moment I realized that my father had not simply made a casual investment years ago. He had made a deliberate decision. The lake house at Cedar Ridge had never been part of the story Daniel had been telling about our family's property. It had always been something else entirely. Something my father intended for me all along. Daniel remained quiet for several long seconds after Robert finished speaking, and the silence in the dining room seemed to stretch across the table like an invisible line none of us wanted to cross. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall, both sounds that had filled this house for decades without anyone ever noticing them. Now they felt strangely loud. Daniel finally pushed his plate slightly away and folded his hands together. Even if Dad signed something years ago, he said slowly, that does not mean the situation stayed that way. His voice was calm again, but there was something careful in the way he chose his words. People change their plans. Robert Klein did not respond immediately. He closed the folder halfway and rested his palm on top of it, the gesture patient and deliberate. If your father had changed his mind, he said, there would be new documentation. Legal transfers do not disappear simply because someone hopes they will. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though he tried to hide it by glancing toward the kitchen as if he were distracted by something there. I watched him carefully now, noticing details that might have slipped past me earlier. The small tension in his shoulders. The way his fingers pressed together a little too firmly. My brother had always been good at sounding confident, but the confidence tonight felt different. It sounded rehearsed rather than natural. You said the taxes were mailed here, Daniel continued after a moment. That does not prove anything about ownership. Robert opened the folder again and turned the document slightly so that the page faced me. The paper made a soft rustling sound against the table. Actually, he said calmly, the county records are very clear. My eyes moved slowly across the page as he spoke. The legal language was dense, but one line stood out unmistakably. Property owner, Margaret Hayes. Seeing it written there in official print made the situation feel suddenly real in a way it had not before. My father had not simply talked about Cedar Ridge in passing. He had taken the formal steps to place it in my name. Dad never told me that, Daniel said quietly. For the first time that evening his voice sounded less certain. I lifted my eyes toward him. Maybe he did not need to, I replied. The words surprised even me. I had not planned to say them, but Once they were spoken, they seemed to settle into the room with quiet clarity. My father had always believed that some decisions did not require explanation. If he thought something was right, he simply did it and trusted that time would reveal the reason. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair. Your father wanted the transfer to remain private until his will was formally reviewed, he said. He believed it would prevent unnecessary disagreements. Daniel gave a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. Well, he said, glancing down at the table, it looks like that plan did not work out. Outside the window, the yard had grown completely dark now, and the porch light cast a pale circle across the grass. I looked again at the document in front of me, at my name printed clearly where I had never expected to see it. And as the quiet settled over the dining room once more, a realization began to form slowly in my mind. My father had trusted that the truth would eventually come out. What he might not have expected was how uncomfortable that truth would make the person sitting across the table from me now. Daniel remained quiet after his last remark, but the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt tense, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. I kept my eyes on the document in front of me, reading the same line again and again as if my mind needed time to accept what it meant. Property owner, Margaret Hayes. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that changed the entire story I had believed about my family's property. My father had not left Cedar Ridge to chance. He had made a decision, signed the papers, and trusted that the truth would be discovered when the time was right. Robert Klein closed the folder gently and rested both hands on the table. There is one more detail, he said. His voice was still calm, but something in the way he spoke made Daniel lift his head quickly. Your father instructed me to confirm the condition of the property after his passing, Robert continued. He wanted to make sure everything remained exactly as he left it. Daniel shifted again, his chair creaking softly. And, he asked. Robert reached into his briefcase and removed a small envelope that looked older than the folder beside it. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of envelope that had clearly been stored away for some time. He placed it carefully on the table in front of me. Your father asked me to give you this if any confusion ever arose regarding Cedar Ridge, he said. My name was written across the front in my father's familiar blue handwriting. Seeing it made my throat tighten unexpectedly. I had not seen that handwriting since the last birthday card he sent me the year before he passed away. Slowly, I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The message was short, written in the same careful script he had always used. Margaret, if you are reading this, it means someone has finally asked questions about the lake house. I bought Cedar Ridge because you always felt at peace there. Daniel prefers the city, but you always listened to the quiet of the water the same way I did. That place was never meant to be an investment. It was meant to be a home for the person who understood it. I read the words twice before lowering the letter back to the table. Across from me, Daniel looked away, staring toward the dark window again as if the reflection there had suddenly become very interesting. Robert folded his hands once more and spoke in the same steady tone. Your father also asked me to visit the property last week, he said. Daniel turned back immediately. Why would you do that? He asked. Robert met his gaze calmly. Because your father was concerned that someone might try to take control of the lake house before Margaret understood it belonged to her. The quiet that followed was different from the silence earlier in the evening. This time it carried the unmistakable feeling that the truth, once hidden beneath years of assumptions, was finally standing in the open where none of us could pretend not to see it. The words from my father's letter rested quietly on the table between us, but their meaning filled the entire room. For a long moment none of us spoke. Daniel stared toward the window again, his reflection faint in the dark glass, while Robert Klein remained still beside the folder of documents. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope, running my fingers once along the edge as if I were trying to hold on to the last trace of my father's voice. He never mentioned any of this to me, Daniel finally said. His tone was quieter now, the confident edge gone. Robert answered without raising his voice. Your father believed the decision would make sense in time. Daniel gave a slow breath and leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling as though the answer might be written there. I spent 3 years fixing that place, he said after a moment. I replaced the dock, repainted the porch, even repaired the roof last fall. His words carried the sound of someone trying to justify something that no longer fit the facts. I looked at him calmly. Maybe you thought you were preparing it for yourself, I said. The statement was not meant to accuse him. It simply felt like the truth that had finally settled into place. Robert adjusted his glasses slightly and spoke again. Your father was aware that Daniel had been visiting Cedar Ridge, he said. That was part of the reason he asked me to check on the property after his passing. Daniel turned quickly toward him. You checked it, he asked. Robert nodded. Last week. Another quiet moment passed. I could hear the faint wind outside brushing against the trees in the yard, the same soft sound that used to drift across the lake on summer evenings at Cedar Ridge. I realized that the memory no longer felt distant. It felt close, almost waiting. And everything was in good condition, Robert continued. But the county records confirm that the property remains under Margaret's ownership exactly as your father arranged. Daniel lowered his eyes to the table. For the first time that evening he did not try to argue. The steady ticking of the clock continued behind us, marking the seconds in the same patient rhythm my father had listened to for years. Finally Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter than before. I guess Dad knew what he was doing, he said. I looked down at the envelope once more. My father had not been a man who explained every decision. He trusted that people would eventually understand the meaning behind the choices he made. Cedar Ridge had never been about money or ownership. It had always been about the feeling of standing beside quiet water while the world slowed down. I slid the envelope gently back across the table and stood up from my chair. The room felt different now, lighter in a way I had not expected when the conversation began. Outside the porch light still cast its pale circle across the yard, and beyond that the night stretched calm and open. Somewhere nearly 90 miles north, a small lake sat quietly beneath the same dark sky, its surface reflecting the stars just as it always had. And for the first time since my father passed away, I understood that he had left me more than a piece of property. He had left me the place where he believed I truly belonged.